The belief that climate change will destroy the world in our lifetime is having a real psychological toll, especially on young people. In 2017, the American Psychological Society recognized climate anxiety as a real and growing condition. A perfect expression of this apocalyptic outlook is the Netflix film Don't Look Up, a satirical disaster flick in which a comet literally destroys the Earth. The film was written as an allegory for climate change, and as a sign of the state of our culture, it was recently nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards. Welcome to New Ideal Live, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. Today we'll discuss how Don't Look Up takes climate anxiety to a whole new level. I'm Keith Lockitch, and with me is my colleague Elan Journo. Hi, Elan.
Hey Keith.
So let's jump right in. Let's start by talking about this growing phenomenon of climate anxiety. So, Elan, you sent me this New York Times article that mentions climate psychology as a new professional certification that psychologists can obtain. And it talks about this general phenomenon of people being so terrified from the constant barrage of climate catastrophizing that we get all the time that they're at the point of needing psychological help to cope with the anxiety.
Yeah, one of the things that stands out in the article, it's a article with a number of anecdotes, and it's hard to get a sense of how significant a phenomenon it is, but it does cite a significant survey that was published in the Lancet, a British medical journal, that covered 10,000 people in 10 countries, and they were aged 16 to 25, and the results are really astounding. Out of those 10,000 people, 45% said they worry about climate and their worry negatively affects their daily life. And get this, 3/4 of them said they believe, quote, the future is frightening, and 56% said, quote, humanity is doomed.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen other reports also talking about the effect on young people, reports of nightmares, disrupted sleep. Another survey that I saw said that 1 in 5 students said they're planning not to have children because of climate change. I think, young people are especially vulnerable to taking seriously these pronouncements that we hear all the time that the world is going to end by 2030 because of climate change. Now, I don't think we want to overstate the claim. I don't think psychologists are saying, that there's mass anxiety, that they're observing, but just if it's something that psychologists are noting and examining more closely, and I think it's a disturbing trend. Um, Unfortunately, it's not surprising that this is a trend, given the kinds of apocalyptic pronouncements we've been hearing for decades from environmentalism, with no context and no, and a kind of divorce from reality in terms of the claims that they're making.
Yeah, I think that that's true, and I would say that there is something definitely going on, and I think it's not new. I've seen things over the last few years, for a long time now, that suggest this is a growing phenomenon, and I think that there's one anecdote that I read 16 years ago now, and it really stuck with me. And I want to share it with you guys because it was not a column about climate change. It was about technology and children's access to the internet. And this was about a columnist of the New York Times who was, that was his beat, technology, David Pogue. So he was telling a story about how his son at the time was in fourth grade, and he was learning about global warming. And the parent who was writing this was saying, well, in school it's introduced in a way that's sensitive to children's knowledge and so on. So he approved the way it was presented in schools. But then one day his child was let loose on the internet, and he found scenes from Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, which I'm sure a lot of people listening have heard about. It was a big deal when it came out. And he watched the trailer of that, this fourth grade kid. And 30 seconds after the trailer, this kid was sobbing. And he turned to his dad and he said, like, he's seen these before and after pictures in the trailer of what we're heading for. Now, this is in 2006. His son turns to his dad and says, Dad, we only have 10 years to stop it. And that was in 2006. That's the sort of impact. It's obviously another anecdote, but I think it gives you a flavor of what's been brewing in society uh, with the way people are barraged with the messaging around climate change.
Yeah, and we hear people today giving a deadline of 2030 to save the world. So article was 2006, and he said we have 10 years to save the world. So 2016 was his deadline. And of course the world didn't end in 2016. So the question is, when 2030 comes and goes without the end of the world occurring, like 2016 did for this child, will anyone remember or care that these doomsday predictions never come to pass because they were never based on reality in the first place? So we've done podcasts on this in the past. ARI has put out a lot of articles and talks and podcasts giving our perspective on the whole climate issue. So we don't need to spend a lot of time on that, but the part of our position is that one of the major problems we face today is that we get a completely distorted view of climate change from today's culture. The pronouncements that we hear do not reflect reality, and this is part of what's behind why people are why young people especially have this distorted perspective of what's happening, and they're experiencing anxiety and all these psychological effects.
Keith, we might have lost about half of the audience at this point because as soon as you say there's distortions in the science or you start questioning it, people they get sort of agitated because they think, oh, you're one of these people, you don't believe in the science, you don't believe in the truth. So what I want to throw back at you and say is that's a very strong claim that there's distortions here. So maybe you can give us some examples of what you take to be uh, uh, problems in the way this is communicated, and what would it look like to treat the science seriously?
Yeah, so again, we're not going to have launch a whole discussion of climate science here, but I wanted to what I wanted to point to is some of the ways in which the information that we hear is distorted and is not presented accurately in a way that captures the full context of what's happening. So just I had one little anecdote that I um, wanted to present here. So just it's one little example or factoid or a little nugget of information. So the climate activist Bill McKibben. So he's a longtime climate alarmist. He wrote a book called The End of Nature, and he's a very prominent environmentalist who's been talking about the climate change issue for years. Um, there's one little number that he likes to drop into his articles, his talks, that is kind of a little factoid that I think is it's one small concrete example, but I think it's illustrates the wider phenomenon that we're talking about here. So the factoid that he likes to use, and I'm going to quote from an article. He says, he points out that the extra heat, this is a quote, the extra heat we trap near the planet every day is equivalent to the heat from 400,000 bombs, the size of the one that was dropped on Hiroshima, unquote. So he's saying the effect that our carbon dioxide emissions are having is that they're trapping extra heat not into the atmosphere of the Earth, and the amount of extra heat that we trap every day, he's saying, is equivalent to 400,000 Hiroshimas, basically. Now, I think this is exactly the kind of statement that people find terrifying, and that young people hear this. I mean, who wouldn't be terrified? Climate change is like 400,000 nuclear bombs going off every day. I mean, a comet slamming into the Earth would be, like a garden party compared to that, right? It seems like so. But so the reason I want to bring this up, though, is because there's no context that we're given to put this number into perspective. I mentioned this to my kids, and my son's first reaction was, no, that can't be right. So the fact is, the number actually is roughly accurate. It is true. This little 400,000 Hiroshimas being the extra heat that we trap every day as a result of carbon dioxide emissions and so on, that's an accurate number. But it's a half truth because there's no context to put it in perspective. So let's give it some context. Let's put this into perspective. And let's ask the question, how much energy, heat energy, does the Earth receive every day from the sunlight that shines on its surface? So I'm going to throw this to you, Elan. We didn't talk about this in advance. So if you had to guess, and you had to put it in terms of, how many Hiroshima bombs per day worth of energy do you think we get just from the sunlight shining on the Earth? So
Uh,
remember, he's
that,
saying he's
that's,
saying climate change is
yeah,
causing 400,000 per day. So what do you think?
maybe 500,000. I don't know. I have no idea.
Okay, so so the amount of energy that we get in the atmosphere just from sunlight shining on the Earth, 476 million Hiroshimas per day. Okay, so I think that gives you a little perspective, right? How scary does Bill McKibben's number seem now? Like we don't view sunshine as nuclear Armageddon, right? But this is the impression that McKibben wants to create for us about climate change, and it's completely dishonest. And I think the reason this kind of half truth works is because we don't have we're not used to thinking about things on the scale of the entire earth. People aren't used to thinking in terms of heat energy and physics concepts like that. So he can pull a statistical sleight of hand like this, throw a number like that at his readers with no context or no perspective, no way of judging what that number even means. And it's a complete distortion. It's a complete distortion of reality. And I think it's really dishonest of someone like McKibben to throw a number like that out. Um, you know, More broadly, just to give another example, we see media reports about climate disasters all the time, and I think it would be surprising if people didn't draw the conclusion that things are getting worse and worse every year. If you were to ask people if you were to ask someone, how many people do you think die every year from climate related disasters, and is that number getting better or is it getting worse? I think most people would say the answer is obvious. Obviously, things must be getting worse. Climate change is destroying the planet. So, but if you look at the data and you look at the numbers, maybe we could put this graph up. Um, so the truth is exactly the opposite. Climate related deaths are a tiny fraction of what they are or what they were a century ago. So something it's dropped by like 98%. And the reason for that, the point here is that industrial development powered by fossil fuels has made it possible for us to build safer structures, advanced warning systems, and all the infrastructure that we need to keep us safe and prevent disasters from harming us. People have become way less at risk from climate disasters because of our use of fossil fuels. But this benefit that we get from using fossil fuels never gets discussed. All that gets discussed is the claim that it's causing climate change, and this apparently allegedly is going to is going to destroy the earth and make everything worse. So these are the kinds of examples that I'm talking about, and you could multiply these kinds of examples ad infinitum. I think the thing I really want to stress here is that our culture is not having an honest conversation about climate and energy. The conversation is completely distorted, dominated by distortions, half truths, and lies, like the kinds of examples that I just gave.
Yeah, and if I can just throw something in there. So I mentioned the example of An Inconvenient Truth. That's Al Gore. He won a Nobel Prize for putting out that movie and being a spokesman on this issue. And Bill McKibben, for people who don't follow his career, the article you were quoting from was in the New Yorker. So he's not a fringe figure. I mean, as far as I understand, he's well in the mainstream of sort of setting the trends and shaping people's views.
Can I just jump in there? Because whenever people mention Al Gore's Nobel Prize, I have to stress it was the Peace Prize. So
Oh,
Al Gore
excuse
and
me.
the international and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the UN's body, they were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their work on climate. This was not a scientific prize, but people like to conveniently there's a convenient truth that people like to drop.
Someday we should have a conversation about the Nobel Peace Prizes and just the Nobel Prizes in general, because I think they're an
Yeah.
interesting cultural indicator. Anyway, so let's talk about
Yeah.
Well, let's move to Don't Look Up and get into that a little. And just to set the context, I mean, it's everywhere. I'm sure a lot of people listening now have either watched it or are planning to watch it. As you said, it was a huge hit. It still is a huge hit for Netflix, Netflix original, and it's up for a number of Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Original Screenplay. So not the minor ones, not makeup and so the kind of technical things, but center of the page. This is the message of the movie. That's what's being celebrated. And we're going to have, it's unavoidable to give spoilers for the movie. So if you haven't watched it, pause, go watch the movie, come back and listen to this conversation if you don't want to have us talk about it. But I mean, it's been covered so widely in the press. I'm surprised if there are people who still don't know what the story is about.
I think I'll jump in and give a bit of the context here,
Okay.
which is, I think you're back. But so the premise of the movie is two astronomers discover that there's an enormous comet that's heading on a collision course with the Earth. It's going to be like an extinction level event, and the people of Earth have 6 months to do something about it, or it's literally going to be the end of the world. Did you want to pick up there, Elan? Are you back?
Yeah, I was just going to say that the story is meant as an allegory for climate change and the disaster that is said to be heading toward us. And it's, as you said earlier, it's a broad satire, and it's not skewering only political people and political responses to the disaster, but also media and journalism and the whole culture around communications in our society. And then more broadly, the way our society has become superficially obsessed with superficial things and ignoring more important issues. So there's a whole sub story about how we're obsessed with social media and the lives of celebrities. So we're not going to get into all the aspects of the satire, but just to get that on the table. And the other thing is, this is not a movie review. We're not going to hear talk about the aesthetic aspects of this movie. We're going to treat it chiefly as a commentary about the climate issue, and we're going to evaluate its theme, its core message, as a work of a cultural product. And I mean, I don't know what your reaction to the movie was. I found it fascinating. I didn't enjoy it, but I found it fascinating. I have so many things to say about it. I wish we could make it the focus. But did you want to add a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, just to acknowledge, like, I did find the film entertaining. I don't know whether it was Oscar worthy. It certainly had a stellar cast. I mean, you got the major A-list actors signing up, and I think that is telling in and of itself. That you've got major star. I mean, Leonardo DiCaprio is somebody who's always been sort of a climate activist. You've got all these people. Just it reflects the standing of this issue in the culture that all these stellar A-list actors would sign up to join this film. I also think it's worth mentioning that, and this is something we're not going to go into in great detail, so I just want to mention it briefly at the beginning. My understanding is that the filmmakers started writing the screenplay before the pandemic, and they explicitly intended it as an allegory about climate change. That's what they've said explicitly in interviews. But I think they said that as they watched the pandemic unfold, elements of the way our culture and politicians responded to the pandemic also kind of made their way in the film. And in some ways, in my view, as a satire parodying the pandemic response, I actually found the film more interesting and more insightful, and more there's more to get out of it from that perspective than because the whole idea that climate change is like a comet hitting the Earth is just ridiculous. So these other things are not our focus today. And again, we're not film critics. We're not here to review the film. But I thought it was worth mentioning these things up front just to kind of get them out of the way. And what we're focusing on, though, is the intention of using this as an allegory for climate change. So,
sure. So let's talk a bit about the core of what is being satirized and the targets of the movie, the screenwriters, and what they're trying to poke at. And I think the main joke, that where the satire, when it becomes parodic, is that there's a planet-destroying comet heading toward us on a definite timeline, and it's only 6 months. It's not distant in the future. It's not future generations who will suffer. It's everyone alive in the present. But nobody cares. No one in power, no one in significant standing cares. And the scientists who discovered it have to struggle to convince the politicians, particularly the president and all her staff, that this is a thing and that this matters and that it's not to be sneered at or scoffed at. And then there's a whole struggle to get through the media landscape and get the message out to a broader population. So those are the main targets of the satires. That the politicians don't want to hear about it. It's gonna be problematic, and then the media. And then just to dig in a bit about this, it really, I think, is meant to map on to, if you take it as a climate allegory, then think about the politicians and how that translates. So when finally the scientists, after being made to wait hours and hours and hours for an audience with the president, now this is the 6 months and days left and the world's going to end, and they're keeping these guys waiting in the hallway with Cheetos and water bottles. And finally they get an audience with the president, and the president is, well, this is her main concern is the midterms and what's this going to do, and she's struggling with a crisis concerning her nominee for the Supreme Court, who's unqualified, and that's really occupying her attention. And this whole thing of a planet-destroying comet, well, let's, as she says in the movie, and you might have seen this in some of the clips, let's sit and assess. Let's come back to it. Let's see what happens and figure out what we want to do. And here's like a telling little anecdote, a telling detail from the way the film was made. When the scientists try to impress upon the president, this is a certainty, this is going to happen, it's 100% going to happen. The politicians are always looking at, are you sure it's 100%? Is it, well, it's 98.7. Oh, okay, so it's not 100%. That's better. We can live with that. Can we tone it down to 70%? Okay, it's 70%. Let's go with that. And then one of the scientists, the one who discovers it, says, well, that's not at all the same thing. 70% likelihood versus 90, not whatever, 99% is very different. And why aren't you getting this? And their whole attitude towards the truth is contemptuous. They don't care about what's true and false. What they care about is what can they say to not harm their political chances in the next few weeks. So that there's an attack on the politicians, and there's a lot more to say about how that comes through. Then the media, just one quick thing about the media, so that one of the recourses that the scientists take when they see that there isn't really anyone listening to them in the Oval Office, they try to leak the story. And so they go to what is in effect the New York Times, but it's not called that in the movie, and they're all over it. Yeah, we'll take this. This is interesting. We're going to be the breakthrough forum for you. And they leak the story, they publish it, and then what happens next is that the story doesn't perform well. It doesn't get a lot of clicks. It doesn't do well on social media. Other stories swamp it completely, the stories of celebrities breaking up and so on. And so what you get is the newspaper backing away from the commitment to the truth. And then further complicating this is we find out that one of the government scientists dismisses it, and so that authority gets to trump the truth. And so in effect, the newspaper isn't interested, and then there's still further struggle, but what you get is the news media is corrupt, the politicians are corrupt, they're not interested in the truth. And then just finally and briefly, and we'll come back to this, another major target is the business world, particularly businesses that have a lot of political influence, and that's a major plot point. We can get into that in more discussion, but major organs of society, from the Oval Office to the news media in various forms, and business, they're all ignoring the truth. They're not interested in the truth. They're interested, they have ulterior motives, all of which are banal, corrupt, and dishonest in fundamental ways. So that gives you a flavor of what this is trying to satirize. So having said that, let's talk a bit about how this cashes out in the context of the points you were raising earlier, Keith, about how our existing discussions about climate are already distorted and dishonest. And the movie makers, as I read this, they're basically absorbing everything that's in the mainstream and turning that into a script that reflects those kinds of ideas. So let's talk about some of the takeaways there. I think the major one is that nobody cares about the truth. Science is swamped by short-range considerations in politics, re-election, social media, clicks, and just the myopia of general people whose interests are really narrow, and nobody's telling the truth. Nobody's speaking up. That's one of the takeaways. I think it's hard to miss that one in the movie. It's not subtle at all. And my just one thought about that before I hand it back to you, Keith, to see your thoughts is when I reflect on this, I think if the movie's criticism, one of its criticisms is that they think the media and others in the culture who are in a position to speak about this issue are not saying enough about climate change. If the satire is that they're dismissing it and not concerned with the truth and so forth, what would it look like for them to be talking about it more and taking it seriously? Because my experience is it's everywhere, it's unavoidable, and it's deafening. It's in your face. You can't go to the grocery store, you can't turn on the radio, you can't watch any media without confronting it. So there's something really weird about that perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen that perspective also. Like Greta Thunberg has talked about, learning about climate change and then wondering why people weren't talking about it more. She's looking around and she doesn't see anybody talking about it or doing anything about it. And I have the same reaction that you, as you hear about it, all you hear all the time is how the world is going to end from climate change. So what is she looking at? But it's a different perspective. And the worst part of it is what it means to, quote, do something about climate change, according to our culture and our culture's intellectual leaders, is, essentially to cut off completely all the forms of energy production that actually work in producing reliable, affordable, abundant energy. Um, it reminds me of just of something that I noticed. I wrote a short article about it during the pandemic. There was a story that got a little bit of attention during the pandemic that was related to the fact that the worldwide carbon emissions dropped dramatically in 2020 compared to 2019. So there was this huge drop in carbon emissions. And there were some news sites that were sort of hailing this as good news. But, the fact is the reason it happened is because of the total shutdown of the global economy that happened during the pandemic. So everybody stopped going to work. Nobody was driving. We were all locked down. And yeah, so that there was a drop in carbon emissions. So I think, the real story here is the all these constant cries that we need to do something about climate change. The real story here is that it's the proposed response to climate change that would be like a comet destroying the Earth. It's the abundant, affordable, reliable energy provided by fossil fuels and also nuclear power. That's what has made it possible for human beings to flourish on this planet. But what our culture means about, when we talk about doing something about climate change, is eliminating all of that, and that is what would really be destructive of our ability to live and flourish on this planet. So um, this is part of the dropped context and the distorted picture that we get about the issue, and this obviously this is not something that the movie addresses at all.
So just to take another kind of takeaway for someone watching the movie, what would they get and how would that impact them? How does it connect with this issue of climate anxiety? One of the things you see in the story is that early on, there seems to be a reasonable plan and a way to try to fix the problem. Like there is a plan, it's put into effect, but the opportunity early on is squandered. And the reason it's squandered is that the short-sighted, the criminally short-sighted politicians and the greedy businessmen and the greedy politicians who are in cahoots with them, because of their pursuit of profits, they're willing to sacrifice and risk lives, and they squander the chance to do something early. And it doesn't work. And what we end up with is there's no fallback plan. There's one shot, and then it turns out that, well, apocalypse is now within sight. We can actually see the comet coming towards us. There's no escape from it. And this whole thing about we had a chance early on. If we had only done something, and that we need to act. All of this is just a channeling of the conventional view that, as you were saying earlier, that's distorted and in many cases dishonest about what the nature of the problem really is and what it would look like to address whatever problems you might think there really are. And I mean, there could be problems. There are such things as smog, and you might find ways to deal with that. And there's other kinds of things that are legitimate to consider. But none of the solutions that people talk about and the timelines for doing them have any bearing on actual solutions.
Yeah, and the this, I think the point you're bringing out here is that this is another way in which the movie distorts the issue. What it means to do something about the comet is to send up nuclear, a fleet of nuclear bombs to blow it up so that it doesn't smash into the earth as a giant 10-kilometer wide missile, basically. But what effect would that have on people trying to live their lives on Earth? Very little. Whereas what it would mean to do, so, as I was saying before, what it would mean to do something, quote unquote, about climate change would literally destroy people's ability to flourish and live on Earth, because it would, by destroying our ability to use the energy that basically keeps us all going. So um,
So one way in which this connects to our topic of anxiety and how people are starting to feel like the world is ending and there's sort of psychological after consequences for that is that if you map this onto the climate issue, if you take just transfer the comet to the climate, and you can see how anyone who's responsible, sensible, concerned about their lives and their children, how this would really engender anxiety in them. Because what can you do if the people who have the power are completely irresponsible, unconcerned with the truth or facts? And these forces, they're being irresponsible. They're obviously not doing what needs to be done. And it's left to individuals. And what can individuals actually do? And here you get into some of the paradoxes or impossible situations. And you've written about this. I remember there was an article you wrote about, I think, the people having a lot of anxiety about using disposable diapers or grocery bags and so forth. And it's a real thing that people face. And I just want to share an example of this from the New York Times story that we talked about earlier, about this whole new area in psychology where people are getting help because they have what is identified as climate-related anxiety. And so here's the story of a young mother in her late 30s. She's at the grocery store and she's going to buy a bag of nuts, but she's panicked, or she has this experience because she feels conflicted. I mean, she's busy and she wants to buy these nuts because it's part of her grocery list, but they're packaged in plastic. And what kind of impact will that have on the planet? And she's just standing there in the aisle, gnawed by anxiety. And as the article puts it, quote, she really longed to make less of a mark on the earth. But she also had baby in diapers and a full-time job and a 5-year-old who wanted snacks. And these conflicting forces were slowly closing in on her like a set of jaws. Now, if that's the experience a lot of people are having, or some people are having, you can see, well, no one else is going to do anything. It's up to me to make these small changes, these small sacrifices in my life to have it. But what is it actually going to do? And look at the negative outcomes for me. Like I need this, I need these groceries. I have a whole family to deal with. So you can see how this whole atmosphere of the way we're pushed to minimize our carbon footprint, quote unquote, and just to consider the planet as the first thing in your mind when you go to the grocery store, when you fill up your tank and so forth. So this is something we're breathing in and out in the atmosphere.
Yeah, and again, I think young people are especially susceptible to being influenced by these things, and being and susceptible to the fact that we don't get the full context. All they hear are these factoids and claims that the Earth is, ending in 10 years, and they don't get the full context to see that that's not true.
Okay, so one other point that I think leaps off the screen when you watch this movie, and it's important because I think it's telling of what is the message of the movie and how it connects to the allegory. I think the point of the satire, like a lot of what we hear about the climate, is to induce guilt and anxiety by reproaching everyone for their failures. So all the way from the Oval Office down to the people who end up in a riot because they discover what's happening and that they've been closing their eyes to the problem and now they're panicking. This happens in the movie. And the part of this, the mechanism in the movie in this is that the satire has a kind of if the shoe fits, wear it approach. So if you're the kind of person who's like the politicians and corrupt and you're telling everyone, don't look up, don't look at that's the point of the title, right? Don't look up at the comet, it's not there, let's ignore it, we can fix this through other means. You're part of the problem destroying the earth because you're seeking profits, or as the scientist who discovered it, Kate, she goes home and her parents won't let her in because they don't want the politics. And what they tell her is, we're for the jobs the comet is going to create. And you know who they're supposed to be satirizing, right? There are people who are so stupid that they think jobs are more important than the climate future. So, or are you part of the anti-scientific movement who are telling you don't look up? Are you the kind who is rationalizing, there's going to be upsides to this, there are going to be jobs, there's going to be profits? Are you the kind of person who, as many of them are depicted in the movie, is completely checked out? Your whole life revolves around the escapades of celebrities and movie stars, and you don't even have the inkling of the problem we're dealing with, and you're being irresponsible in the way you're living because you're contributing to it. So if yes on any of these or many of the other targets in the movie, shame on you. That's the message. Shame on you. You're not doing enough. You're not saying enough. And you should feel guilt and you should feel the sting of humiliation for all of that. And coming away from the movie, I think that's one of the powerful things a movie can do, is really dramatize. You should feel bad about your role in this. I had the reaction of, well, I've heard this before. This is not new. It's not original for sure. It's just everywhere in the culture. And the one thing that echoed in my ears was one of the many statements we've heard from Greta Thunberg. And I think this really encapsulates it. We want to play a quick clip of her putting this forward. And I think this is what the movie is trying to convey, I think, is captured in the next 90 seconds by Greta Thunberg in exactly the way I think they want you to take it. So let's play that.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe.
So she's admonishing the world not to look away, and the movie is admonishing the world, the people who would have you not look up. So I think the thrust there is really identical, different forms for the same kind of theme.
Yeah, and and just the idea that for 30 years the science has been unequivocal. This is a reflection of the way in which we have not had an honest discussion about the scientific issues. And there's been a whole set of books that have been coming out. This is, over the years there have been scientists who've challenged the perspective that climate change is this world-ending catastrophe, and the whole thrust of the culture is to silence those voices and to not let not let that message be heard, and it continues to this day. And this is what this is what she's sort of cashing in on. Um, with that in mind, I wanted to take up. We got a super chat question that's relevant to this exact point. This is a super chat from Henry who says, if the quote climate apocalypse is exaggerated, but man-made climate change is still real, what does ARI recommend doing? Either way, greenhouse gas emission at our current rate will harm human life. So the that claim is precisely the thing that is lacking context. We're going to share some resources at the end, but that the idea that you can look at the purportedly negative effects of human greenhouse gas emissions without looking at the benefits that they bring us and the ways in which they improve human life, make it possible for us to build resiliency and protection against climate, and just make it possible for us to live a human life in the modern world. The idea that that greenhouse gas emissions will harm human life, that I think in itself is a premise that needs to be challenged. And again, I said we'll have some resources at the end that we can point you to, where you can get more information on that. Somebody else on Zoom asked a question: is there a list of references one can go to?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that, and then we can get to the Zoom. So let me follow up and sort of take that person's question further and ask you. So let's say that we don't know, or it can't be established what the exact causality is, but there is warming and it's going to cause certain kinds of effects. One is, what do you think about what would it take to cope with them, and what are solutions to some of the kind of problems? Like, is air pollution going to get worse? Are we going to deal? How would we? What would it look like to solve some of these if there are real problems?
I mean, just to give one example, the issue of wildfires. The claim that wildfires are on the rise because of climate change. I mean, one of the things I think has emerged and has become very clear in the last decades is that our management of forests has been a disaster, and we've allowed. This is something I've written about. The graph that we showed was a link to a website from Alex Epstein. I think we might as well mention him at this point. Alex, for those of you who don't know him, he's a former colleague of ours at ARI. He went off to start his own organization, and he's a leading expert who's been a very prominent voice on climate and energy. And he has a website called Energy Talking Points. That's one resource that I wanted to send people to. He has a lot of information on issues like this, but so he's written on this. I've written on this issue as well. But the idea that we allow the fuel loads in forests to grow the way they do without trimming them back, without doing controlled burns, without managing them. This is the reason why we have these crazy wildfires every season. It's not because of the changes in the climate. The leading cause is that we're not managing them properly, and so there are things that we can be doing to mitigate these problems instead of just blaming it on the climate. And you could multiply these kinds of examples ad infinitum. We could go down the entire list of. There's a whole litany of catastrophic effects that we supposedly face, and each one of them there are solutions that don't involve shutting down the world's economy by cutting off our ability to have energy.
So let's go back to the question you started reading out.
Well, actually, it was is there a list of references you can go to research the data that we showed in the graph? And so Alex's website is a good starting point for that. I should have mentioned I borrowed that graph from his Energy Talking Points website. So we'll have some links at the end, but
I want to take us in a slightly different direction. I think we have a few minutes more to get one other topic that I don't think we can do full justice to, but I think we have to put it on the table. And one of the things that is distinctive about the movie and its message is it's a very brazen attack on business, and the portrayal of business leaders is, I think, really unjust. And even though my view is not that all business people are good, but that there are good business people, and there are ones that are corrupt and that seek favors and unearned kickbacks from government and so-called crony capitalism. That is a real phenomenon. They certainly don't deserve that kind of those benefits. But there are productive business people and innovators in all fields, and the movie just smears them all as power seekers and profit-driven to the point of criminal irresponsibility. And so I think it's worth just bringing out that point. And I think you had a thought about the way in which the role of business comes into this.
Yeah, as a plot point, so the president is finally convinced to try to destroy the comet, and they're actually launch this whole fleet of nuclear weapons to go and destroy it. And at the last minute, they abort the mission. Why? Because this tech billionaire has identified that the comet that's hurtling toward Earth is rich with like quadrillions of dollars worth of rare earth minerals and all this sort of thing. And so instead of just blowing it up, we need to somehow, break it up into pieces and have it drop on the Earth so that we can extract the mineral value out of this comet. And then, and the way this unfolds is that the tech billionaire's science and his rocket mission is a complete failure, and the comet ends up hitting the Earth. But the idea, so this is meant to capture the claim that it's greedy, it's the short-sighted greed of large corporations that's responsible for destroying the Earth. That's the idea. And so it's not surprising that Hollywood once again is distorting and attacking, distorting the true perspective on what business and what billionaires, the value they create and what kind of things they bring to the world. But what's interesting is there's a way in which they try to. This is an attempt to deflect the idea that there's any individual responsibility here. If it's all the big corporations that are the villains, that's part of the message that they're trying to get across. And I there's an interesting argument that I hear. So Michael Mann, he's the guy that came up with that hockey stick graph that was famous. The idea that that climate change is suddenly changing, the climate relative to what it's been like for the last 10,000 years. So he's argued that even the point of emphasizing that there are things that individuals can do, like changing personal consumption habits and so on, is basically a ploy on the part of fossil fuel companies to shift the blame and deflect policy away from targeting them as companies. He's even said that, the whole idea of the carbon footprint, where we can each calculate how much we as an individual contribute to climate change. This is just sort of a corporate ploy that was invented by British Petroleum, to affect this kind of mindset, to get people to say, look, it's not the fossil fuel companies, it's individuals. You have to change your consumption. You have to change your habits. So it's just part of this this idea that businesses that pursue profit, somehow that is short-sighted and self-destructive, and the reductio ad absurdum of it is we're just going to let greed out of greed, we're just going to let a comet destroy the Earth.
Yeah. We could do a whole separate conversation just about the movie's other plot lines and how that illustrates the point that greed and the desire for self-interest in more general terms is so destructive. And I think that goes to a core of what's going on in this story. So maybe, I'd be interested in slightly wider perspective on this, Keith, because I wanted to talk about this movie in connection with climate because I think it's a cultural artifact. It tells us where we are in certain issues, where we are in certain trends.
Yeah. Um, so, I mean, climate change has become the major issue of the environmental movement. And I think the, decades ago, environmentalism was sort of an ism. People could recognize it as an ideological movement, and it had different issues that it was talking about. I think climate change has become so mainstream and so conventional in the way people think about it, it's difficult to recognize that it actually is a perspective, based on a certain worldview. And it's interesting to go back. So in 1970, Ayn Rand gave a talk that became an article on environmentalism called The Anti-Industrial Revolution. And in her analysis, this is none of the issues that environmentalists raise fundamentally are really about the science. Though, they're wrapped up in scientific questions, they're wrapped up in scientific data, but fundamentally it's a moral ideological issue. Um, and it's the core idea behind the whole environmental perspective is the idea of subordinating human life to wild, untouched, pristine nature. Um, and so it's the question of, do you take a human perspective that our goal should be to, the focus of our, if we're thinking about human beings and our relationship to nature, the focus should be on how do we create a world that's optimal for human beings to live and flourish and be happy. But that's not the environmental perspective. The environmental perspective is, how do we prevent human beings from having any impact on nature and from disrupting the pristine, untouched character of nature. And so in her analysis, what she ultimately gets to in this discussion is that the whole ideology is predicated on sacrifice and guilt and fear and the kinds of anxieties that we're talking about today. This is the point of the movement, is to induce these kinds of emotions. So she has this great quote from towards the end of the article that I just wanted to share here, that this is the basic perspective that we get. In confrontation with nature, their plea is, leave well enough alone. Do not upset the balance of nature. Do not disturb the birds, the forests, the swamps, the oceans. Do not rock the boat or even build one. Don't experiment. Do not venture out. What was good enough for our anthropoid ancestors is good enough for us. Adjust to the winds, the rains, the man-eating tigers, the malarial mosquitoes, the tsetse flies. Do not rebel. Do not anger the unknowable demons who rule it all. This is the kind of worldview that we get, that we're tampering with these great forces of nature, and by doing so, we're going to destroy the planet. And what we should do is cower in fear and anxiety over that phenomenon.
Yeah. So, well, let's. We've got some questions. I don't think we're going to get to them here, but we can invite people to join us in a few minutes when we close here. We'll be hopping over into Clubhouse if you want to ask us more questions, talk more about the implications of the movie, its standing in the culture, and so on. We'd love to have you join us. We'll be there as soon as we hang up here. We'll move there. So, Keith, did you have some? You mentioned earlier some resources. Maybe we should walk through some of those.
Yeah, so I just mentioned Ayn Rand's article, The Anti-Industrial Revolution. That's available on our website. There's a link there that you can get to. I think this is a must-read to get Ayn Rand's perspective on what was then called the ecology movement. And again, it was written, 50 years ago, but it's super prescient about the nature and goals of the environmentalist movement. I think everything she talked about then you can see playing out in the last half century. One thing that came out a little bit in the discussion here was my claim that as a result of industrial capitalism powered by fossil fuels, we're far safer from climate than we've ever been in human history. So this article that we have a link to here, this is a discussion that I have about this. I think it's also worth, we didn't put a link here or an image, but Alex Epstein, who we mentioned earlier, He has a book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels that also goes into this issue a little bit. And I wanted to take this opportunity to publicize Alex Epstein's. He has a forthcoming book called Fossil Future. That's the publication date is April 19th, but you can pre-order it today so that you get it in time for Earth Day, which is April 22nd. I haven't read the book yet, but I know that our colleague Onkar Gate worked with Alex in Alex's writing of this book. So, I think we can expect that it's going to be a really valuable contribution to the debate. And if people pre-order it, that'll help, make sure there's enough copies for people to, for the publisher will print enough copies, so that it doesn't risk going out of print. So, yeah, so check out those resources. And next week's show, the topic and presenters are still TBD. There was a mishap with a cat that we had to change the schedule a little bit. So I might hear more about that in the future. But we'll be back at the usual time with something interesting like we always do. And I'll just wrap up with our usual remarks that if you enjoyed the podcast, please subscribe to the channel on YouTube. Click the bell for notifications for when we go live. If you're watching the recording, please like, comment, share, help us attract new viewers. Consider doing the same if you're watching on Facebook or one of our other platforms. If you have questions or comments about today's episode or suggestions for future episodes, send us an email at newideal@aynrand.org. We definitely read all of them. We reply to most of them. And we've definitely done shows based on suggestions that people have sent us. So we look forward to hearing from you. And I think we'll draw a line there and we'll hop over to anyone who wants to continue talking about Don't Look Up or any of the things we discussed. Come join us on Clubhouse and we'll see you in a few minutes. Thanks, Elan.
Thanks. Bye-bye.